Welcome to our newest episode of Rock the Closing. Today, we are going to talk about what is the due diligence process for a condo and a co-op. Let's just dive in. Dalia, what various aspects of due diligence is there when someone is selling a condo co-op or buying a condo co-op?
Okay, so due diligence in this area is really important. First thing we start off with is the buyer's observation. So when you're buying a condo or a co-op, the first part of due diligence, which you might not think about, is the actual buyer's view of what's going on in the apartment, right? So when you go in, what do you see? What do you smell? All these kind of things. So that's the very first step, right? Like, do you like what you see? Is it, what's the condition of the apartment? That kind of thing. The next step is that the buyer hires a professional inspector, and that person reviews the apartment and the building from top to bottom. So they're checking the sturdiness of the walls, all various types of things like that. We'll get into that in a minute. And the next step is that the buyer's attorney will review the documents of the building, of the apartment, various public websites. And then what the buyer's attorney also does is, through the management company, they will submit an attorney questionnaire and read the board minutes. Okay, so all these things are part of the due diligence before we close on a condo or a co-op. So, Orsolya, what exactly does the inspector do during these inspections for the buyer?
Right. The inspector is brought in and is hired after an offer is accepted by the seller. Usually the buyer or the buyer's broker is arranging for it and the inspector is coming in. Again, very important, after our offer is accepted and before the contract is signed. The inspector will come into the building to review the apartment itself and the building very thoroughly, more from a technical perspective. So, for example, he or she is going to check the electric outlets, will open the windows, check if the windows are opening easily or are they stuck or is there any issues with the windows. He will review the electric stove or the stove that's in the apartment. Is everything lighting up there? Check on the water pressure in the shower or the bathroom. And just walk through the apartment with a technical sort of eye, checking if any tile is falling off. Are any pieces of the floor missing? So he will make note of all these. In addition to that, he will walk through the entire building and mostly look for what is the remaining life of this really big equipment that keeps the building operational, such as the boiler, the roof, elevator. He will check on the laundry. And at the end, he will make a very comprehensive report. Most of them I've seen come with pictures so that you can also visualize, the buyer can visualize and see what are the problems with the building. This report is used to inform both the buyer and the buyer's attorney in order to help them to make a final decision before signing the contract. Okay, so what are the documents that are reviewed by the attorney, Dalia?
Okay, so the buyer's attorney reviews various documents that are sent over from the condo or the co-op. And if you own a condo or a co-op, if you've ever sold one or bought one, you may recall hearing these terms at your closing or during the process of your closing. And you might not have really taken a good look at them. Some of those documents include the offering plan and the amendments for the building, the house rules for the building, the lease and sublease policies, the alteration policy, and the smoking policy for the building. So these are some of the things that the buyer attorney will review. Orsolya, what are some things that can be found in these documents?
Yeah, there might be quite a few things that could be found in this document, but mostly what attorneys are looking for are outstanding items and some risk. So, for example, in an offering plan, we will be looking for lot line windows. A lot line window is that the building is built, and, for example, on one side of the building, there are a couple of windows, and they are saying that because we have built so close to the neighboring lot, which is empty, that in case another building is built up, these windows will have to be closed. This is a lot line window. So this is a risk. So you have to inform your buyer that right now you have a window in your bathroom, but if the neighbor is building up a new building, a new construction, you may lose that window. So that's one risk that buyer has to take. Obviously, there are also structural issues which will come up again in the offering plan. For example, some buildings, some parts in Manhattan are environmental hazards. So there needs to be a constant review of the foundation and what's coming up, what mitigates some kind of, chemicals coming from the ground. This is also something we inform the buyer about. And this is usually annual report and measurements undertaken by the management to address these issues. So some structural issues could be there, but we are also reviewing the offering plan to confirm the square footage of the apartment or the number of shares allocated to a certain apartment. Another issue that I like to mention and highlight when I have a buyer purchasing a new condominium building is very often mold is excluded as a warranty. So the original developer is giving a 1 month warranty if there is mold in the apartment after the purchase. This is usually happening because the new constructions do not have windows in the bathroom. So that's why mold is excluded. You also learn from the offering plans how the building is going to be operated or how it's operated, what type of decision-making processes are put in place. In other documents, for example, in house rules, you can find rules about what happens if you are late with your maintenance or common charges. You might have to pay additional charges, how you can put plants on your balcony, on your terrace. There might be some kind of limits in terms of how heavy plants you can plant. There is noise mitigation sometimes included, which is you have to have 80% of your apartment covered by a carpet in order to avoid noise for your neighbor. And obviously there is the pet policy included, which we will be talking in another episode more in detail. And then alteration policies are the renovations, looking into how you can renovate. For example, some are talking about what kind of approval process there is from just repainting your apartment till making structural changes. So some co-ops, condos are quite strict, and there might be also some green requirements which are very new, which we start to see in co-ops and condos. But enough of that. Dalia, what public websites would an attorney review during the due diligence process?
Okay, yes. So I did mention that the attorney will review some of the information on the public websites for the building. So some of those would be the Department of Buildings website, the Department of Finance's website, and of course, ACRIS. So Ursula, why don't you tell us what can be found on these websites? What are we looking for? What are we looking at when we're looking for a buyer?
So yeah, for example, you mentioned ACRIS, which is the New York's automated for recording the deeds and the ownership of the deeds and recording of any liens, mortgages that are on the apartment itself. This comes up when you are looking at particularly at condominiums. You can look back, you can open this public website and you can just see who were the previous owners or whether there is any kind of mortgage or encumbrances on the property. It's very informative and very interesting. On the other websites, for example, on the finances websites, you can find out if the cooperative building has failed to pay taxes in the last 15 years. That would be something that you highlight to your buyer that, hey, this is going to come out from your pocket at some point, at least a portion of it. Otherwise, the Department of Building, there you can find some really interesting information, for example, about open permits. So whenever you do some work in the apartment, your contractor is required to take out permits from the city that he is doing everything up to code. And very often he takes out this, constructors are taking out these permits and then they forgot to close it out when the work has completed. In order to close out permit, you need to have someone from the city come to inspect and sign off on it and say all is done, all is well, all is up to code. And then open permits can be a big headache, especially for the seller, because these have to be closed out before closing on the given unit. And sometimes open permits come out that has not been taken out by the seller, but by the previous owners. So again, this is a big headache. Or sometimes you don't see an open permit, which can be also alerting. You walk into a co-op and it's been freshly renovated. Everything is in a different place where it's originally been. Then you will obviously be starting questions. How did you move the pipe? How did you upgrade the electricity lines without having a permit? What's the guarantee that it's not going to be faulty the moment the new buyer is going to move in? Okay, there could be also violations against the building or against the apartment. For example, complaints that odor is coming out. Someone is really cooking some really delicious marijuana in the apartment, so the neighbors constantly call 311 complaining about the apartment. That's also something good to know. Or finally, there could be any kind of litigation ongoing either against the building or the apartment. Let me stop here. So let's turn into what is an attorney questionnaire? Whom is it sent to? And what are some typical questions, Dalia?
Okay, great question. And those are some amazing concerns that you brought up there on the last question. Very important stuff. Some of those things you might not find on the public websites. And so you may want to have your attorney put them in the attorney questionnaire. So the buyer's attorney will formulate an attorney questionnaire. Everybody's questionnaire is, kind of specific to them. So what are the finances of the apartment, of the building? What is the maintenance fee? Are there any assessments currently? Are there any planned assessments? What is the history of assessments? Because a maintenance fee might be low when you look at an apartment, like, hey, this is great. This maintenance fee is really low. However, they're constantly having assessments that could be up to 50% of your maintenance, which is huge. So that's definitely something you want to consider if, your monthly payments you're thinking about are your mortgage and your maintenance. You definitely want to know if there's going to be planned assessments, past history of large assessments, things like that. Another thing we want to find out is the gas and electric included in the maintenance fee? A lot of times they are, a lot of times they're not. Okay. Is there a flip tax when the apartment is sold? That's another question you want to find out. A lot of times that is being pondered or thrown back and forth about whether that's going to be an issue between the board and the owners, right? Another question you want to ask is, how much debt does the building have? Do they have any loans against them? Is there any financing going on? That's important to know. The health of the building, it's sort of like, what is your financial picture, right? A person has their assets and their liabilities, well, so do buildings. And that's something to consider, because if the building is not financially healthy and you own a portion of the building as a condo or a co-op, then you're part of that picture of health for the building, right? So you definitely want to have the full picture before you get in there. Also, we want to ask about whether there's a pet policy or a smoking policy. Do you smoke? Is that even allowed? Do you have pets? Maybe some buildings only allow cats, and you have a tiny little dog. You don't even think about it when you're going to look at an apartment, but you could very well be rejected. I think we talked about that in a previous episode regarding a pet policy that wasn't known about or spoken about before the closing. Also, we want to know, when does a proprietary lease expire? That will usually be in some of the documents sent over by the board, but you definitely want to ask that. We also want to ask about some unit-specific questions, right? So aside from what's going on in the building, when you get into your apartment or your condo or your co-op, who covers the window repairs? What are the noise issues? Like Orsolya mentioned, are there any complaints? Like, is somebody cooking something nearby and it's coming in through all the vents? Are you going to be subject to, smells and sounds that you were not expecting when you initially went and viewed the apartment? Okay. Has there been any damage? Was there a recent fire in that apartment and then it was painted over or what have you, right? So you want to know, has there been any damage, any alterations to that apartment, right? That will be important, coupled with the permit issue that we just spoke about. So you want to know what's been changed. Has anything been changed? And then lastly, you want to find out, are there any restrictions as to who can live there, who can purchase there? Can you have overnight guests? For how long? Can you rent it? Things like that. Restrictions on occupancy. Okay, so that's really important as well because people don't often understand or know or are notified that there are restrictions as to who can stay there, who can live there with them. So that's important to know. So all these things will be in an attorney questionnaire. There are things that you might not even think about when you're purchasing, but your attorney is thinking about that for you. Okay. Orsolya, we talked about also board minutes needing to be reviewed. Why don't you tell us what are these board minutes and what's in them?
So the board minute is usually my absolute favorite to read, but nowadays, they depend. Because if the building is managed by one of the large managing companies, then usually the board minutes will not be informative. They will be very short and succinct. They will usually just say management report was discussed or financials were agreed on. And that concludes the board minute. However, when there are detailed board minutes, then you can learn so much about the building because they will provide you a very good insight what's happening, how the building is operated, and how the neighbors and owners interact with one another. So, for example, I read one board minute where for a number of years there was a dispute between neighbors or one neighbor leaving their shoes in front of the apartment, and they even had to assign a board member who was dealing with this dispute, the shoes being left outside of the apartment door. And this has become a huge issue. But yeah, joke aside, board minutes can tell you about what is, for example, the building planning, what kind of major capital improvements the board is getting ready for, what is discussed. Is the roof going to be replaced? Are windows going to be, for example, replaced? Where is the money going to come for all this replacement? Do they plan an increase in the maintenance or an additional assessment, as you have mentioned? You also want to know how neighbors are dealing with one another. Are there many disputes between the neighbors, or is it a friendly building that we are talking about? You can also, from board minutes, see if there is any infestation going on, which you want to confirm through board minutes. If there are any bed bugs on the floor that your buyer is trying to purchase an apartment in, that's going to be something definitely to flag to your buyer that, hey, 2 apartments down, there was a bed bug infestation 2 years ago, just for you to be aware of it. So anything could be in the board minutes. However, again, nowadays this might not be informative, but usually it gives a very good complementary information to the attorney questionnaire and to the available documents and public website. Dalia, this is all from me for now.
Sounds good. This is a lot of information, and we do hope that it helps you understand the process of due diligence a little better. Do understand it is a lot of information to process, though. So please drop a comment or a question on the site if you have any. And we thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Rock the Closing. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for tuning in to Rock the Closing. This podcast is hosted by real estate attorneys who offer valuable insights. Please remember that the content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Always consult a qualified professional before making any decisions. This podcast is copyrighted by Rock the Closing, and any reproduction, syndication, or rebroadcasting of the content requires written permission.